Hey everyone, my name is Caroline Jensen and this is how I edit these little Muscari. This is an iPhone picture right here. I just walked by and I was checking on the status of the flowers in my garden, which things are ready, which things are not ready, and I grabbed my phone and I just quickly took this picture. This is typical of what you see with a phone. There's a lot going on, the greens are really neon, there's a lot of stuff in the background, it's not particularly pretty. So I went and got my big camera, my A7R5 and my 90mm macro from Sony, and my Westcott lighting, which is the FJ400 strobe and an umbrella and a little stand. I keep that out in my front porch all summer long and I drag it out to the garden as needed when I want to make a portrait of something that I see there. So this is what I ended up with, and it's definitely not edited and it's definitely not perfect in its original form. The reason being, I had a bit of trouble. So I have this huge light source and I could have used a smaller flash, but the same problem would remain: too much light. When you have little things that are all crowded together like this, to be able to illuminate one versus many means that I have to have a light source that can be directed. And one of my favorite things to do is use a tiny LED light source like a Nan light or the Westcott used to have what looks like an ice light. They don't really sell those anymore, but something that is an LED light that's very close. Trouble is I didn't have that on hand, and so I was using my big light. In order to get a portrait of this, I decided to have most of the light, 99% of the light, flash me in the face. So the big strobe was bouncing into the big umbrella and it was all facing me. And just the edge of it was about even with this little tiny flower. This huge light modifier was just outside the frame and it's flashing toward the camera and it just grazed across this little guy. Now, I want to do a few things. I want to adjust the color. I want to increase the light because while this is an okay exposure, it's too dark. And I want to give it a little bit of drama. So let's get started. I'm going to go over to my favorite tool in Lightroom, which is the brush section. And that is right here. It's a little circle with the dots around it, and it's the masking section, properly called. What I want to do is select my subject. I could go in and globally increase the exposure all the way around, but I really want to keep the background dark and as well as the foreground. In this case, it selects just the little blossom. It does have a bit of spillover here, so I'm going to use the subtract function and grab a brush that's pretty small, not that small, and I'm just going to remove it from the little leaf here, or stem. I think it's a leaf. Doesn't have to be perfect. I just don't necessarily want that to be super bright as I edit. Okay. And then I'm going to increase the exposure like that. Now, this could be how it was lit. If I had had the proper light source for such a tiny subject, I could have just illuminated that part, but I didn't. So this is what I'm doing. I'm fixing it this way. The next thing that I want to do is just zoom in and make sure that I'm working on a good file. If I zoom into 100%, which is my usually preferred amount to zoom into, it looks nice and sharp. So that's good. And then I want to adjust color. I'm going to go down to the color area, which is below the tone curve, color mixer. And I'm going to use hue, saturation, and luminance to adjust the color of this blossom. Now I'm going to go over to hue first, and I want to make it more blue. It was really more blue to my eye, and in order to do that, I'm going to use the blue and the aqua sliders. Moving the blue over to the left is going to make it appear more blue, and if I go too far, it's going to be quite aqua or cyan or teal. So I want to zoom in, and I want to bring it back to the place where it's a nice navy blue. This is more purple. Right there looks good. And then if I move the aqua over, it's also going to make it blue. By moving it to the right, I'm moving some of that aqua out. And then I'm going to pop over to luminance and increase the luminance of the blue. You see how that brightens it up a lot. Now this can really have a drastic effect on the lighting. You don't necessarily just do global lighting like exposure, highlights, or whites. You can also use the luminance of the color of your subject in order to enhance that. Most skin is orange, regardless of how bright or dark the skin is, and so using orange and luminance is often going to pump light into anybody's face. In this case, it's blue. And then I might go to saturation and increase the saturation of the blue just to give more depth to the color. I'm also going to go over to saturation and pull some yellow out of the greens. By moving it left, it just takes the green from being neon to being a little less drastic. I also could go to the luminance and lower the luminance, the yellow as well, to darken that. Although you have to always be careful with yellow and luminance. Luminance and yellow don't always get along. You can see some pretty wild stuff. So just be careful when using yellow. Now I'm going to bring this over to Photoshop. So I'm going to go Edit in Photoshop. You see, it was pretty good when we started. It wasn't amazing, but it's pretty good. And if I wanted to do a series of spring floral images for my wall, maybe 5 or 4 pictures in a row, this would be a great subject for that kind of a setting. I'm always thinking about, what could I do with this photo? What's the point of this photo? Is it going to live somewhere outside of my computer? And if I wanted to do, maybe one daffodil and one Muscari and perhaps a tulip and put them in a row, it would make sense. It's a spring ensemble. All right, one of my favorite filters to use is exposure software, so I'm going to open that up. Exposure software is probably my favorite color modifying program. It has a lot of things that I use. In this case, I am using Fuji 400 with grain removed, which is a preset that I have saved. And this is the before and this is the after. I've also used the light effects at a low opacity. Here's something that I like to mention about lighting. When I am looking at a strobe, casting a modeling light over my subject, it often has light that I physically see hitting the subject. I see the light. But when the flash goes off, it becomes a much more plain and yet dramatic look. And so I sometimes like to add in a little bit of that light, either artificially, or I will sometimes use a small handheld light or things like Christmas lights or something that I am shooting through to add in a little bit of that light. But I just like to add a little bit of the hint that there is a light source there. It's just pleasing to the eye, it fills in the blanks of something that I'm physically seeing with my eyeballs, but I'm not physically seeing in the resulting image. So it's a bit of a fix for that. And this looks good to me, so I'm going to hit apply. The one thing you want to be super careful about is adding light where it doesn't make sense. I don't ever really add this kind of light unless I'm using a strobe, which is casting light on purpose onto a subject. And sometimes I will use light other than a flash, so I will use a handheld light, and that can sometimes create this look when I flare it into the camera. So I might be hand holding a light and it's illuminating this little guy and it's actually flowing into the lens of the camera and I'm getting a little flare, and that is real light that I add quite often. It's the result of the type of light I'm using. So I'm going to flatten this out. I always flatten usually. Once I'm done with the picture, I'm pretty much done with it. I don't plan on re-editing it, but as you can see, the edit doesn't take that long. Command S to save it back. And we'll let it open up. And then this is the final little picture. A glaring difference from what we get with our iPhone. Pretty fun. Thank you for joining me. Bye-bye.